as I didn't really start out to be an artist, nor did I start out to become an activist, although my experience in Costa Rica with this group CODESE that was protecting the watershed coming down from the mountains above Escazú, I realized that, as I said, we have to protect what we love. And when we moved to Miami Shores 11 years ago, the longest we'd lived anywhere in our adult lives was 4 years in Palermo, Sicily. Other than that, it was 2 years in Havana, 3 years in Costa Rica. So it was a lot of moving around, a lot of change. I did become a jewelry designer and a sculptor in those years as well, because they were sort of easier to do than art, which sort of took more time and effort and energy, and I had to do something creative. But it wasn't really until I moved here 11 years ago and put down roots for the first time in our adult lives, and I realized that I was transformed one day when I saw what I didn't know what it was. It was a jade jewel with a gold crown hanging from a leaf. And I didn't put two and two together immediately that my landscaper had brought some milkweed and I'd seen the caterpillars, but I didn't realize that this was a monarch chrysalis. And when I realized what it was and that there was this orange and black flying creature being concocted inside this jade jewel, it transformed me on the spot. And I went from being an egocentric gardener, thinking about what pleases me, what would please the neighbors, what matches our awnings, into an ecocentric gardener. And at that point, I started planting as many host and nectar plants as possible. At the time, I hadn't realized that you could plant things in your garden to attract butterflies, despite having spent 3 years in Costa Rica with the gorgeous blue morpho butterflies. We'd put out plates of fruit for the birds, but it never occurred to me to plant for butterflies. And slowly over time, I was getting more and more species of butterflies, and the butterflies would become sort of ambassadors flying out into the neighborhood, and neighbors would start to say, how do I invite them into my garden? So, and then I realized at the same time when we were living here, nobody was talking about climate change and sea level rise, despite the fact that Miami Shores is on the edge of the rising seas. The village manager at the time said it doesn't exist. He said finally, well, there's nothing we can do about it. And then I went to a conference of the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact, and somebody said at that conference just stuck with me. He said, there has to be a paradigm shift in thinking so that every expenditure of taxpayer dollars is put through the lens of climate change and sea level rise. Otherwise, it's an irresponsible expenditure. And my reaction to that was, yeah, that's so obvious, but how do you create a paradigm shift in a region where it's business as usual or there's nothing we can do about it? So over time, I kept thinking about this in my head, and I was out in my garden one day and I realized I had a paradigm shift when I found that monarch chrysalis. A young woman who had pulled up on the swale, and I saw her, and she seemed to be in trouble. So I went out and brought her into my garden. She was weeping so hard that she said that she couldn't see the road anymore. So that's why she had stopped there. And I brought her and I sat her under what was then a passion vine awning. And the passion vine is a host plant for 3 butterflies that exist around here. And this one had been mostly eaten by caterpillars, but what that left behind were a lot of chrysalises, and there was a cloud of zebra butterflies flying overhead. And in an instant, her face went from grief-stricken to awestruck. What else could do that? It was just the most amazing transformation. Then my lovely 89 at that time, now 98-year-old mother-in-law came down for a visit. She suffers from seasonal affective disorder. She lives in New Hampshire, so it's a problem. She'd lost her husband not too long ago. They'd lost a daughter. So she was very much a glass half empty person when she arrived one winter 10 years ago, I think. And she watched the process of metamorphosis happen over and over again in the garden, and she left a glass half full person. So at age 89, glass half empty to glass half full, that is a paradigm shift. another friend, she and her husband came for dinner, and I gave the guests, a tour of my butterfly garden before dinner. And it was around just before dusk. And it was the time of evening when male Atala butterflies perform aerial acrobatics. And they're to impress females. And I happened to have a lot of the Atala butterflies at that time. So the guests were all standing there with their jaw agape, watching this phenomenon, this spectacle. And then the next day, my friend texted me to say that her husband had agreed to stop using Roundup, which he had refused to do despite the fact that their dog had been diagnosed with a cancer associated with the use of Roundup. That wasn't enough to get him to stop it, but seeing those Atala butterflies was. So I realized that butterflies create paradigm shifts in people. They are transformative. And if we want people to take care of nature, then we have to start by connecting them. And what better way than through butterflies? So that's how I just, at that moment, a light bulb went off over my head, and I marched inside and I said to my husband, we're going to start a nonprofit. And he said, we are? And I said, yes. I said, we're going to call it Bound by Beauty. And he said, we are? I said, yes. And bless his heart, he helped us get registered as a 501c3. And we began to use butterflies in all sorts of ways to get people to stop using herbicides, to start carving up their lawn and planting these plants for butterflies and other pollinators. And over time, it really evolved. A lot of people have been inspired. We got involved with schools because we believe very strongly that kids need to be connected to nature. And then over time, there was one incident where I saw this beautiful, there was a butterfly meadow right in downtown Miami Shores that I'm sure most people driving by would have said, oh, those are weeds and look at all those moths. But it was not. These were wild native butterfly host plants and hundreds of butterflies fluttering over there. And I was so mesmerized by the sight. I could have stood there and watched all day as all the cars were passing by without realizing what was right in front of them. But then I went back a week later and they were all gone. All the butterflies were gone. And they had obviously sprayed insecticide. And that just broke my heart. That was such a huge loss. And I thought, how can we transform weeds into wildflowers? And then I thought, well, if you transform beggars, and other marginalized people into human beings worthy of contemplation through the power of art, why can't we do the same with plants and create plant portraits? I had a list at that time of 17 wild native butterfly host plants that are native to South Florida, some in other parts of Florida as well. And I had met a young woman named Kim Heisey, an artist who is very attuned with the flora and fauna of Southeast Florida. And I had met her at a conference of the Critically Imperiled Butterflies Working Group. And I wrote her and I said, Kim, would you be willing to collaborate with us on turning these 17 lawn weeds into wildflowers that perform important roles in the ecosystem? She was delighted, and she took it very seriously, and she's created 17 absolutely beautiful plant portraits. We had an exhibit at our local library called Weeds to Wildflowers featuring her plant portraits, and the librarians loved that so much, and they came and saw my portraits, and they wanted us to do a joint exhibit of my people portraits and her plant portraits. That was called Transforming Mindsets Through Art. We've turned her portraits into a field guide to wild plants that host butterflies. We've used them with ID cards to take kids on wild plant scavenger hunts in a local park where they don't use herbicides or insecticides. And we use them we did these beautiful posters involving all of these 17 plants and the butterflies that host on them. And they're now being used every August and September in the Mount Dora Library when they have a Pollinators in the Park exhibit. So our portraits are now up there in Mount Dora, Florida, educating people about these important lawn weeds, AKA, wildflowers that host butterflies. So that, to be able to use art to educate people who are far away is, in fact, I've had people post on my Facebook page from Mongolia, from Madagascar. So art reaches people. And in fact, you know, this connection with this librarian in Mount Dora, the Pollinators in the Park exhibit every year is based on photographs. They have a photography contest of photographs taken in the Noonan Butterfly Garden, which surrounds the library. And she sent me a beautiful drawing of the design. And this all started with an Eagle Scout project, and I happened to be the project advisor for a young Girl Scout in the village who is doing her project on her Gold Award project on pollinator patches, very similar to what Bound by Beauty is doing with our lawn weeds turned wildflowers. And it was through that connection that I realized I had saved up money to create a wheelchair accessible path through my garden. But when I found out it would take 12 days of men with heavy equipment tearing up my garden, I realized that couldn't happen. And then I realized they had just installed a new wheelchair ramp at Brockway Library, and it was the perfect thing if I could use my that money that I'd saved up and create a native wildlife garden in a public space so that people in wheelchairs, moms in strollers, that it would be accessible to all, and we can use this to educate people and hopefully send out tendrils into the community in the form of seedlings, in the form of seeds, in the form of cuttings, and have all sorts of workshops to educate people and to inspire them to create more resilient and sustainable gardens rather than the usual manicured mindset, which unfortunately typifies a lot of Miami shores.